welcome to Debate in Lund, Debatt in Lund, for the 15th time since we introduced this concept 3 years ago. My name is Andreas Ekström. I can usually be found in the newsroom at regional paper Sydsvenskan, but tonight Lund University is hosting this event. We're proud to do that. We're proud to do that with the university, just to make sure that the university will never be a place where the doors are closed. We want it to be open. We want for all of you to get a chance to meet some of the brilliant researchers who are active here and elsewhere. I would also like to extend a special welcome to those of you who are following this over sydsvenskan.se, the paper website, live broadcast for the first time. So special welcome to you. So what are we up to for the next hour? Well, it's not your stereotypical debate where only one person is allowed to speak at a time. We like when people interrupt. We also like when you interrupt. We're going to take questions throughout the night. I'm going to ask you to just give me a big hand up. This is not really raising your hand. This is raising your hand. So make sure you do that nice and big so I don't miss you when we take questions. But we are going to perform this a little different today. And, that's since one of our panelists is just someone really special. On my right-hand side, honorary Dr. Lawrence Lessig. Lawrence Lessig is probably known to most of you for his work on legal matters. He's also an honorary doctor now in the subject of sociology of law. And the Creative Commons discussion has made him a household name for internet-interested people around the world. But that's not really what we're going to be talking about mostly tonight. We're kind of changing the subject because Lawrence Lessig decided to change the subject. You now devote your time to battling corruption. That's one big thing to take on.
Yeah, well, taking on Hollywood seemed small after a while, so I needed to take a really impossible task, which was to take on corruption, right, in the biggest sense.
I've heard you once explain why you have decided to fight this battle, even though you kind of can't win. Would you care to tell us again? You got that question at one point. Why do you do it if you can't win?
That answer requires a little bit more emotion in the evening. So let's bracket that. But here's the basic motivation. So 6 years ago, I kind of recognized that though we were making progress among ordinary, people, citizens around the world, and businesses and universities and parents about the need to update the policy, the framework around intellectual property, at least in Washington, there was no progress on that at all. So it seemed to me that unless we could make progress on this more fundamental question, we were not going to make progress on even esoteric questions like copyright, but much more fundamental questions like climate change legislation or healthcare legislation. So the decision for me was this is the fundamental problem blocking American democracy. And whether we can solve that problem or not in the immediate term, this is the one we have to solve.
Mm-hmm. So I've heard you argue that your issue is not necessarily the most important issue, but the first.
Yeah. So again, I want to be very parochial about this. Democracy is a big word. I don't know anything about democracies around the world. I don't want to pretend to have a view on the health of democracies in every place where democracy now exists. I do have a view about American democracy. And it's American democracy, I think, that is fundamentally corrupted and broken. And my view is, unless we find a way to address that, American democracy cannot address any of the most important issues it needs to address. So when I give talks, which I've given literally hundreds of these talks over the last couple of years, the constant refrain is, I don't care if you're from the right or from the left. Regardless of your political perspective, I can show you how you're not going to get from government what you want so long as this system of corruption survives.
So tell us a little bit more about what you mean. You say the system is broken. How so broken?
Well, it's hard to see because it's been a slow progress to where we are right now. But as Hemingway writes in how did we go bankrupt slowly at first and then very quickly? And so that's what happened with us. And what's happened is America, starting in the 1990s, radically changed the way candidates for Congress raised the funds they needed to run for Congress. So, initially Congress became incredibly competitive, and the leaders basically sent the members out to raise the money to fight the campaigns to win control of Congress. Till we get to the point where we are right now, where members spend anywhere between 30 and 70% of their time raising money to get back to Congress or to get their party back into power. And they do this it would be comical if it weren't so tragic. They're not allowed to raise money in their offices on Capitol Hill. So they have these telemarketing offices just off of Capitol Hill. So their life is basically running from Capitol Hill to these telemarketing offices. And if you saw them, they're these like office building with cubicles, and they come in and they put a headset on and they sit there and they dial for hours a day people they've never met, asking them to fund their campaigns. Now, it would be one thing if they were randomly dialing Americans, right? Randomly dialing all Americans. So a representative sample of America was being called by Congress, and congressmen were begging for the money they needed to run their campaigns. But it's not a representative sample. It's a tiny, tiny slice of the richest Americans. It's basically 0.05% of America. 1/20th of 1% of America are the relevant funders of these campaigns. So, I don't know if you remember the image of a Skinner box, which is the device where you put a rat or a pigeon in, and the rat or the pigeon, after a while, learns what order of buttons it needs to peck in order to get the food it needs to get. That is the life of a congressman, the rat, or let's say pigeon, in the Skinner box. And over time, as you do that, as any of us would do that, they develop this kind of sixth sense, this awareness about how what they do might affect their ability to raise money. And this subtle, not so subtle, this deep focus, I think, has radically changed their capacity to govern. And it's completely obvious. You've got a government right now that cannot address any single issue. Even after we had the tragedy in Sandy Hook with the children being murdered by this gun craziness, even then, 90% of Americans were supporting the most timid kind of background check legislation. 90% of Americans expressed support for that, and it could not get through the United States Senate because of the extraordinary power of the gun lobby inside of Washington. So this becomes the fundamental thing we have to fix if we're going to fix anything.
So I've heard you talk about this before, and I've read some of your stuff. Do you see any hope anywhere?
Yeah, so speaking purely rationally about it, it's hopeless, totally hopeless.
Right, yeah, that's kind of my point. So,
yeah.
If we want to avoid a collective suicide here, please pick us up somehow. Yeah. Do you see anything at all?
Yeah, so, it's hopeless from the American perspective because basically everybody inside the Beltway of Washington benefits from the system as it is right now. Mm-hmm. And they are also the only political power we've got, people inside the Beltway of Washington. So this is a political change, but we've kind of lost the political capacity to act, except through those professional politicians. It's a lot like, when I was dealing with issues around intellectual property, the thing that struck me was the way the internet was reviving what I called read-write culture. It took us from a couch potato culture where we sat there and consumed read-only culture, consumed what other people were giving us, and encouraged and revived the sense of people creating and sharing their creativity. That's the kind of change we need with politics, because politics in America, even today, is still very passive, like sit on your couch, shut up, listen to the television commercials, and vote the way you're told. And a tiny fraction of America votes, the rest of America just sits home. But we've got to find a way to revive that, an citizen-engaged politics, and that is an extremely hard thing to imagine doing. And so that's the sense in which it feels hopeless. But the other side about that is, and this is the question you're fishing for, a minute ago. I was hit with this question. I write about this in my book. I was speaking at Dartmouth, and a woman said, Professor, you've convinced me. This is completely hopeless. There's nothing we can do. And when she said this to me, I was struggling to think about how I could respond. And what came to my mind, and I haven't had a chance to talk to my shrink about this, so I don't know quite why, but here, what came to my mind was the image of my son's brother, who at the time was his age, 6 years old. And I had this image of, my son, being told that my son had terminal brain cancer. The doctor said, there's nothing we can do. I'm sorry. There's nothing that can be done. And I thought, well, would I do nothing? Just accept it? That's it? There's nothing we can do? And obviously the answer is no. You would do absolutely everything you can. And that triggered a recognition of what, this is what love means, right? Love means the willingness to do whatever the hell you can, the odds be damned. And the next step was obvious, even we liberals in America love our country, right? It's not just the right-wing crazies, even we liberals. So the question was, could we find that kind of love of country that would say, I don't care about the odds here. What I know is this is the fight we have to win. And even if you convince me, even if we as political scientists sit down and calculate there is no chance, it doesn't change the obligation as citizens to find a way to fight however we can to try to recover it.
But you were also a political human being at a young age. You were on the verge of starting a career as a Republican politician back in the 70s, 80s.
Yeah, I grew up, but yeah, I started as a Republican.
But reading on the internet today, people place you almost all over the place. But to help everybody out, where would you put yourself on the political scale today? You call yourself liberal?
Yeah, which in America means on the left. Not to say that we have much of a left in America, but that means on the left.
Left by American standards.
In American standards.
Yeah,
right.
that's our far right. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
Right. Right. No, I started as a teenage Republican. I was the youngest member of a delegation in the 1980 convention that nominated Ronald Reagan. Right. But that was a long time ago.
Yeah, so. we're gonna push into that. We got some supporters. I take it. We're gonna take the debate scene with our friends over here now. I'm just gonna ask you something a little off track here. I guess most people here are very politically interested, big political buffs. Some of you online watching this surely as well. You may know that Lawrence Lessig, the character Lawrence Lessig, not the man himself, has actually been a character on The West Wing. The TV show called The White House in Swedish. That's what makes me the most starstruck about you, I think. How did that come about? Can't you just tell us how that came about? Did they ask you permission to use your name?
Oh, of course. It's Hollywood. They always ask permission.
Of course. Yeah. And you thought, my name is Creative Commons. So
that's right.
So you let them do it. Yeah. What was it like? Did you like it?
It was bizarre, right? So the story is, there's nothing exciting about the story. It's based on a true story. So the story, I was involved in the drafting of the Georgian Constitution, the Republic of Georgia's Constitution, or a draft. And when it was taken back, Shevardnadze didn't like the fact that it didn't have enough power for the president. So he ripped out the presidential power and put in his own presidential power. And when it was introduced in the Georgian parliament, the people who had been part of this drafting process in Chicago, which is where it was done, said, this is not the Chicago draft. Where's the Chicago draft? And Shevardnadze's people said, what's Chicago draft? And they said, we were just in Chicago. We just drafted a constitution. There was no Chicago draft. Nobody was in Chicago. So it was a completely Soviet experience, right? So I taught this at Harvard. I teach constitutional law, so I just told the story to my constitutional law class. And at Harvard, the law students, then at least, they're brilliant and miserable. So this one particularly brilliant and miserable law student decided he wasn't going to be a law student. His name's Josh Singer, and he went off and became a writer for Hollywood. And he wrote this story he became a West Wing writer.
So that's how it happened.
So then they cast it, and they were originally going to cast, somebody like me, not me, but somebody like me. But it was not credible to have a 30-year-old who was, writing Constitution. So they picked a much older, cooler guy than I was.
All right, very good. Now we're going to ask you to take the stage along with the panelists. Please step up and have your seats. Så nu byter jag tillbaka till svenska lite grann, för nu ska jag tala mer som... Ja, vi får visa en applåd här också. Vi ska nu göra i ordning scenen för nästa steg i debatten. Vi ska få några fantastiska panelister som ska diskutera världsläget vad det gäller både demokratins kraft och aktivismens möjligheter. So back to the stage, back to English. We have now accompanying Lawrence Lessig here, we have Tani Nybo. Would you care to just in a sentence or two tell the gang, who are you?
Well, first of all, I'm Danish. I'm invited here because I've done a lot of climate and environmental activism. I'm also an organic farmer in my everyday life, so that's basically it.
What do you grow?
As much as I can.
Oh, good.
Mainly
Good.
vegetables.
All right. Jan Theodell, welcome. Who are you?
Thank you. I'm a professor of political science here at Lund University.
And what's your main focus? What do you study?
Democracy, democratization, and in part corruption too. So pretty much the themes we're going to.
Very good. Yeah, we have a really interesting project that you're involved in that we're going to return to pretty soon. And over on the far right, at least stage side, I don't know if that really corresponds, Mr. Carl Rudbeck.
I'm used to sit on the far right, and I'm very comfortable in that position. I'm a Swedish journalist. I started out as a literary journalist on the cultural page, but I later branched out and write political columns a little bit here and there.
But you were also going into the Arabic language for a while,
Well,
weren't you?
my first subject at the university was Arabic, and I taught Arabic grammar at the Stockholm University, but that was a totally dead subject until 9/11. Then it was suddenly a very saleable commodity, so therefore I picked it up after that.
Okay, very well. So this broad gang will hopefully help us figure some of these big questions out. Here's a short one for the three of you. I'm going to ask Vitani. At one point in your life, did you identify that you were a political human being? What was it that sparked that in you?
That's a good question.
I know, that's what I do.
I actually have. I've been asked that before, and I find it difficult to say at exactly what point. But to be honest, I've always been a rebel. I made trouble in school, and at some stage, that trouble started being political. You know, it wasn't just nonsense and not fitting in. It started being a reflection on like what is wrong with the world today. What is happening here, and then I guess I became political for real when I was 17, and I figured out that I didn't like EU. I didn't like the environmental policies they were putting down on the Danish society. I wasn't that broad thinking at that point, so that was my first opinion. And then I started going into politics and being active around the EU membership of Denmark.
And we're going to get back to the consequences this has led to you
Yeah.
for you as well. Jan, what age, what occurrence made you the political human being?
I can actually answer that very specifically. It was in the fall of 1989 when I worked at the Swedish embassy in Moscow, and when the wall fell and the Eastern European countries became independent and basically threw off the communist system. And I was watching that from the East, so to speak. That didn't make me enter politics, but it made me interested in politics.
But you were already with the ambassador.
I was, but that had no political background.
Okay. And how about Carl?
That's very easy to answer. It was in the 60s. I was a philosophy student at Stockholm University, and this was when the New Left started, and the philosophy department was sort of the center of the New Left. All the communist coryphees like Althusser, Poulantzas were the heroes of that department. And I was part of the philosophy group there, and I realized I didn't agree with anybody. And what they say is absolutely wrong from A to Z, and that's when I became political and then got the, shall we say, reputation of being anti-communist. But before I stop, I would like to add one thing. I must just make a point of what Professor Lessig said, because he confirmed one thing which is very dear to my heart. You said that one of your most brilliant students went to Hollywood to become a scriptwriter, and that just confirms that today the best writers you find in the world are those who write TV series.
Yeah, I often wanted Aaron Sorkin to write a novel, but that's a different debate. I don't think we're going to get him to show. Lawrence, so we mentioned that you were a young Republican. Let's not go into that, but look even further back in your youth. I just have a feeling that you discovered your political vein early.
Yeah, so when I was growing up at the age of, I guess, 12, there was only one Democrat and one lawyer in our family, and they were the same person. And even worse, he was the lead lawyer in the impeachment of Richard Nixon. And so I remember very distinctly him coming up to our home the weekend before Nixon resigned. Basically, his work was over, and he took me for a long walk. And he said, and at that time I was thinking about getting into business, and he was talking about, I understand the attraction of power through money. But what about power through ideas? What about the idea of persuading, using reason to get people to the right side? I thought it was quaint and lefty and silly, but it was the moment I think I began thinking differently about what I would be.
Now, this may take us to different consequences. Tanny, I'm glad to see that you're not in prison right now. You very well could be. Can you tell us a little bit what happened at the Copenhagen Climate Summit a couple of years ago? You were actually charged and even sentenced to a jail term.
I was indeed.
What happened?
Well, what happened? A lot of stuff happened around that, but...
Give us the 30-second version, if you can.
No, basically, I mean, as most of you can remember, we had the UN Climate Summit in Copenhagen in 2009. And by then, I had been active in Greenpeace for around 10 years. I'd done lots of climate activism. Before that, I had more of an unpolitical approach to that. I was like, I believe we can solve that with some goodwill, and I can convince people that we have a problem. But I think somewhere around 2008, 2009, I realized it's not because people don't know. They know there's a problem. They're just not doing anything to solve it. And then we were going to have this climate summit in Copenhagen, and I didn't see any politicians actually coming up with real solutions. I didn't even think Greenpeace was coming with good solutions. They weren't radical enough, because what they were suggesting was not going to solve the problem. So I was like, what to do then? Obviously, a lot of other people felt the same way as me. So I decided to be a spokesperson for some of the more radical voices that was going to the streets, who was demonstrating, who was using civil disobedience to try to get their voices across. Because obviously, it was very hard to shout up and get to talk to the elite who was talking about this and not solving the problem.
So you organized a demonstration, but that doesn't usually make you go to jail. What happened? Why did they charge you?
I was charged with a number of things, and I think basically, I mean, we were probably the only one really shouting out that there is a general problem with the democratic processes here. There was heaps of countries inside the conference who weren't being heard because they didn't have the money to solve the problem. They weren't causing the problem, of course, but it was their people suffering from it. And in solidarity with them, we were trying to shout at the street. And we decided, well, the only way to democratize this debate inside is to open up the summit and make it open for everyone, to make everyone's voices heard. That's not legal. That's crossing some border that some police set up, and in doing that process, I got charged with trespassing, violence against police, lots of other stuff that sent me to jail.
You did serve time?
I served 2 months.
Yeah. We're going to get back to the costs of activism. We're going to try to make this evening be a little bit about the corruption. That's Lawrence's specialty, and move on to what we can do about it, move on to the activism, so then you kind of see why we have the panelists that we have. Jan, I'd like to go to you now. When we talk about corruption, we need to figure out what corruption really is. We can define that in a zillion different ways. But you and some fellow researchers of yours are working on an interesting project to map democracy of the world. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so that project is not on corruption per se, although that's actually one of the topics we're covering, but that's on measuring democracy. Being a political scientist, I of course must say that we can define democracy in many ways. And we tend to use the word democracy I think in two very, very different senses. One is sort of idealistic, something that's sort of a notion that we're striving towards. And I get the feeling, I get the sense that that's what Lawrence is, the way he's using the term. But we can also use the term in a very basic sense as referring to a number of political institutions, such as universal suffrage, having free and fair elections, having political and civil rights established, the kind of political systems that people are fighting for in most parts of the world, although not in our part of the world
so you're
anymore.
Actually measuring this country by country.
And we're trying to capture both these senses, both the basic sense, which most agree upon, and these more controversial senses where people don't agree on what democracy actually is.
So, but based on what Lawrence says, how does the U.S., level here? I mean, most of us would say that U.S., is the world's biggest democracy, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't sound it.
Yeah, but there you go. It is the world's biggest democracy in this basic sense, because they have all these basic institutions, such much as we do in Sweden and in Europe.
But then when we come
but
to
on
measure
the other
function-
hand, if you look at some more idealistic notions, such as is the political system responsive to the electorate at large, for example? I mean, are the politicians doing what the population wants them to? Well, maybe the U.S. doesn't fare that well. And money politics is, of course, one of the most fundamental problems with democracy in this more egalitarian sense in the U.S.
Carl?
When I listened to what Lawrence said, I was struck, this is probably very naive, but you said that the problem was basically in the House of Representatives. Would it be where the term limit is 2 years, isn't it? Wouldn't it be easy then to prolong the term limit, have it as 6 years as in the Senate? Would that solve the problem, or would it alleviate it at least?
No.
No.
No, it wouldn't solve it, wouldn't alleviate it. The problem isn't just the House, it's also the Senate. And in the Senate, too, basically from the first moment you're elected, you're raising money for your next election. Now, that wasn't the case 20 years ago. 20 years ago, you talk to senators and they say, you know, you raised money and you ran for re-election the last year of your term, and the other 5 years you could govern. But now, from the very beginning, it is the fundraising game. But I want to be very clear. I mean, I think it's important to distinguish two very distinct conceptions of corruption. There's the more traditional conception of corruption, which is bribery or violating the rules, quid pro quo, deviation from what the law requires. I don't think, in that sense, the United States Congress is corrupt at all. I think it's one of the cleanest institutions in that sense.
We're talking money in an envelope kind of corruption.
Or even corruption to benefit them personally. Right? It's nothing to do with the problem. I'm happy to stipulate there's none of that, right? But there's a very different sense of corruption, which is the way in which it's developed, where these people are so dependent upon these interests for their very existence inside the system of government that those interests have the power to bend them in the way that they get dependent. So this is, I call it the good soul corruption. These are not people violating the law. They're not evil. They're not unethical in any important sense. But the system that's developed is one that is corrupt and not serving the function of a democracy.
Would you actually say that America was a more democratic country 50 years ago?
Absolutely, yeah.
But then you have I'm an amateur, but you have the feeling that politicians were nominated in uncontrolled processes in the smoky back rooms, and there was no insight at all.
Well, it's not, I don't think there's ever a moment of utopia. There's not kind of a golden past. But there is this fact. The government could actually make decisions about hard questions. We passed the Civil Rights Act. We created an Environmental Protection Agency. We passed fundamental inspection and safety rules for what's called OSHA inside of factories. The EPA and OSHA was passed under a Republican administration, Nixon. Even Ronald Reagan achieved fundamental tax reform through a bipartisan agreement between Democrats and Republicans to radically change the way the tax system functioned. These were moments not when you would ever look at the government and say, that's wonderful, or I want my child to marry one of those people. Not that at all. But at least it did its basic job. It achieved something. And the problem we have now is basically any important issue, literally any important issue that's not just foreign affairs, that has no domestic interest attached to it, any important issue can be blocked by the tiniest number of people who get together and form this funding engine to terrify Congress to avoid that particular issue. And so it's that kind of hold-up power which has developed over time because of the way we're funding the system.
So sometimes we tend to have a high moral standard coming from Sweden. We tend to say that we're not corrupt here. We don't do that. Really?
No.
No?
We have lots of corruption here, but it's much more subtle. I mean, I don't think we have people getting bags of money, but you have certain jobs which are reserved for politicians. You have the EU Parliament, which is one huge place of corruption where people get the sort of sinecures. And you also have a more creeping form of corruption now, which is maybe not even corruption. But you see more and more politicians going from being a politician to become a lobbyist for some kind of organization, work for a PR agency. I don't think they're that might be bad enough. Maybe you should have a quarantine between those two careers. But I think that they suddenly begin to gear their politics to their future career. So the fact that they hope for a job perhaps in the EU Parliament or at a big lobbying firm makes them make decisions which they wouldn't otherwise have done.
So this is a duplicate of the American system that Lawrence describes, right? We talk about the K Street Club. So K Street is the street in Washington, D.C. where all the lobbyists have their big offices. So people want to go from Capitol Hill to K Street.
But it's practically the pattern now that the retired government minister goes to a lobbying firm. And since that has become a pattern, I'm sure they sit while being ministers, making decisions to further their future career.
So Jack, I would say this is a potential corruption problem, but we shouldn't stretch the concept too wide because, I mean, as soon as we start mentioning everything we don't like in politics, corruption, well, then the term loses its meaning. No, and I mean, there are some other areas where I think Sweden has a large potential problem, which, I mean, actually has to do with campaign finance. And this might sound odd from an American perspective, but, you know, campaign finance in Sweden is totally unregulated. We have no laws about it. And you said yourself that the kind of corruption you're talking about is legal, and it's actually regulated the way it works. But in Sweden, I mean, the more we get what in Swedish is typically called personval, that is, you know, the vote among candidates within one political party, because that's very much, I think, the source of the American problem. The more we get that, the more potential there is for money to influence the vote. And that could actually make Sweden also vulnerable for those forms of corruption that Lawrence is talking about.
Yeah, so Jack Abramoff, who is the infamous lobbyist who was convicted of violating 7 or 8 fundamental rules around lobbying, has become a great reformer in this issue, and he's become a friend. And Abramoff says that the most effective technique he had was when he would walk into a Senate office and talk to the chief of staff and say to the chief of staff, "What are you doing in 2 years?" And the chief of staff would say, "I don't know what I'm doing." And he said, "When you're finished, I want you to look me up." And Jack said, from that moment on, I owned that chief of staff, and not a single dollar had changed hands. And it's exactly the sense of the anticipation of what the future life looks like. But in America, that future life is quite lucrative. United Republic calculated the average salary increase for the members of Congress that they tracked moving from Capitol Hill to K Street. And it was something like 1,452%. So it is a very strong incentive to see them move in that kind of future. But I want to push back a little bit about whether this is stretching the concept of corruption. It's a different concept of corruption. It's a more traditional concept of corruption. Modern conception of corruption is very individualistic. It's about an individual violating a rule. But a traditional conception of corruption predicated of institutions or bodies or societies as a whole. And in this sense, the United States Congress is precisely corrupt because the intended dependence that Congress was to have, as the Federalist said, Federalist 52, Madison said, Congress was to be dependent upon the people alone, has been corrupted because now they are also dependent upon this tiny group of funders, and the tiny group of funders is not the people. So in this very traditional sense of the term corruption, the institution has been corrupted. And I agree with you, we can't call everything we don't like corruption, but we have to call this corruption, because it is plainly corruption.
But the risk of doing that is that we underestimate the I would say, miraculous change that our parts of the world, and I include your country and my country, has undergone in historical perspective, which is about getting rid of the illegal forms of corruption that you mentioned yourself, such as bribery and...
So we have a good history of cleaning, which means that we could...
Exactly.
Yeah,
and it's very few countries in the world that has actually undergone that. And I think it's a source of most of the things that we value in our society, actually a more important source than democracy.
Yeah, no, that's right.
And so if we sort of start calling the other thing corruption, we might forget about this huge
transformation.
transformation.
They don't have to be corrupt in that way anymore, because they can look forward to a profitable career as a lobbyist or as an EU parliamentarian. They don't have to do anything illegal, because the legal system is geared for the politicians to become. They don't have to be illegal. So it's, in a way, it's even worse when they can be corrupt within the legal system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So now we made a few remarks on what corruption can be.
I mean, the problem with dark envelopes or envelopes changing hands in the night, that's a rather simple problem which can be solved. This is more insidious problems which we're talking about are much more difficult to eradicate.
Yeah, I was just going to add, but
Lawrence, go
it's
ahead.
not in every part of the world a simple problem to solve. So I agree it's a very difficult problem, and it's incredibly interesting to look at, for example, how Britain solved this problem. But I do think that if you look in the relatively narrow historical perspective, let's say in the last 100 years of American history, the harm done by that more traditional type of corruption, in my view, is small compared to the harm done by this more modern conception of corruption, right? Because, it is this corruption that gave us the financial crisis in 2008. Just take that alone. The harm that was done by that financial crisis, which we have not even begun to address the fundamental causes of that, dwarfs the harm that would be done by the bribery that might lead to a defense contract going one place or another. So I agree with you. Africa is a terribly difficult problem to solve in the more traditional sense of that corruption. That's why I don't want to speak globally about corruption, right? I want to talk about a very specific problem. But I don't think you should minimize the harm that's being done by this particular kind of corruption. It is world historic level of harm.
You mentioned Britain, and I think we have a good example here because they were actually caught. All the British politicians who fiddled around with the law about their apartment, they could have one apartment in one place and one in the other, and they could rent it. They made huge sums of money within a fussily written law. Now, a good paper revealed the case, and many politicians had to resign. But I think here you have a good example how sort of the politicians write laws which make them morally corrupt but not legally. Now they happen to be caught, and that was a good sign. But corruption within the legal system or within the fussily written legal system is much more dangerous.
So we have a few definitions now. We want to now leave the definitions and move on to what we can do to fix it. So we're going to move into activism of different sorts, and that's where we're going to need Tanya's voice a little more. When you were way more hands-on than any of us here. You've actually been out there on the street. First of all, what makes you think that you actually can accomplish something against this massive overpower? What gives you that spirit?
Well, first of all, I think I would like to refer to what you said earlier. I'm not sure I can do anything. I'm not sure it's going to make any difference. But I think, I don't have any kids yet, but if I get kids, I would like to be able to look them in the eyes in like 30, 40 years' time and say, I did my best. I didn't just sit there, watched what happened, and let it go by. And I think, right now we're focusing on this corruption and what it leads to. And I think it's very important that we take it away from looking at the individual politician being corrupted, but looking at where does the corruption come from. The corruption comes from an industry that's growing in economy and in numbers, and therefore gaining more and more power. And I think I agree with your analysis, but I think my critique goes a little bit deeper. I think we cannot solve this problem without also dealing with the root causes, which is a capitalist system which is giving way more power to big companies and taking that power away from the people. So your question is, how do I think it work? Mm. I think the companies have all the money, they have all the access to having opinions. I think as an individual who are not part of a rich elite, who don't have a voice, I think civil disobedience or going to the street, it creates an empowerment, and somehow it make it possible for you to make your voice heard. So I think it is a tool. I don't think it's the only tool, and it's not always effective, but I think it's something to do. It's a little step on the way.
We're going to be ready to take questions now. We have Jannike with the microphone up here. If you're not comfortable asking in English, do ask in Swedish, and I'll translate for the panel. We have a gentleman right here, right next to you. That's convenient. Go ahead, sir.
My name is Per-Åke Albertsson. When we discuss politics in the United States, I used to call it the dollar democracy. And Sweden has been more and more Americanized in different parts of Sweden. And the question is, why is Sweden Americanized? Is it because many Swedes go to the United States? I have done it several times, and I've stayed there for about 3 years.
Let's see what Carl says about that. Why
That's one reason that we are so fascinated by the American society. Or the other reason, maybe what you mentioned, was that the technical development. We have got big companies and so on. It would be interesting to know an answer to this question.
So, Carl, what do you say? You're an internationalist. Are we adopting also bad things from?
Probably, but we also adopt a lot of good things because America is, after all, the most successful country in the world today. They have the best universities, the best culture, make some of the best movies, the best TV. We all live in an American cultural universe.
We got an American student club back here.
We live in an American cultural universe. Mm-hmm. And also it's the only superpower. So it's rather natural that America influence the rest of us. All the technical innovations come from. But I would like to connect with something I really want to say before we get over, because we talked about corruption and how to eradicate it. And I have a feeling we might here face a problem where the solution might be worse than the disease, because those parties in Europe which fight against the kind of corruption Lawrence and I am talking about are often the right-wing populist parties. And if they would achieve great influence, they might eradicate this kind of corruption, but something perhaps much worse would come in instead.
So the liberals on the left need to step up on that then. We have a question in the back. You in the red, sir. We're going to get you a mic. You have one already.
Yes, okay. Thank you very much. This is a question for Lawrence, mainly, but I think the rest of you should reflect upon it. One of the critiques I've heard about your campaigning, Lawrence, is, and I'm going to quote here, "My problem is that he wants to label his system democracy, as though the outcome has been legitimized by some pure, untainted process, when in reality he is trying to rig the outcome to avoid certain democratic outcomes, i.e. the ones that he disagrees with."
So I don't agree with that characterization. Because it's not that I disagree with particular things the government does and therefore I call it corrupt. It's because I don't think that there's a connection between what the people are voting for and what the government does that I think qualifies it as corrupt. You know, if we had an uncorrupted American democracy, it's quite likely the American democracy would do lots of things I would hate. So I would say, I disagree with those things the American democracy has done. But I wouldn't call them corrupt, because corruption is referring to the distortion that's introduced by the way we have concentrated the funding of elections. So I'm not committed to the view that democracy is going to get the right answers to a whole range of questions, mainly because I'm quite committed to the view that I've been wrong about what the right answer is to a whole range of questions, so I'm hopeful that it doesn't necessarily agree with what I think. But I think from an analytic perspective, it's absolutely clear the system has been corrupted, and if we fixed it, at least you couldn't complain about the corruption when you point to the results of whatever the American
But if you want to tag something on to that reflection that I was thinking about before, this is really about, so do you want to change the system to make it work your way? But it's also about how you measure that something is really legitimate. And a question for both of you, how do you know when activism is legitimate? 100 people on the street blocking a transport, that's not a democracy, that's not a decision we all made, that's what we want you guys to do there. You could also argue that you're actually blocking a democratic process as you do that. So for both of you, how do you value check that your activism is fair, relevant, democratic?
Yeah, well, the means you adopt. So, I admire the courage of your means. In the United States, it is a lot more dangerous to adopt those means, at least to do them online. In the United States, one of my close friends who committed suicide this year, Aaron Swartz, faced the reality of a criminal prosecution system in the United States, which is so absolutely extreme. He wasn't facing 2 months in jail for his quote, crimes. He was facing, the government said, up to 35 years in jail for his electronic crimes.
And he just made academic works available for the public. That's what he did.
He was downloading academic works. So the means of protest, I think, is a hard question, and it's become very, very difficult in the United States. But I want to say, the root of what you're asking is, when do we think we have a system that's functioning well, right? And I think that the answer to that has got to appeal to what you think the machine's supposed to be doing, right? So again, the NRA, the National Rifle Association, is an enormously powerful group in the United States, not just because of money, but because there are a lot of Americans who, in my view, crazily, insanely embrace this gun culture and believe it's the most important thing American can defend. If we had a well-functioning democracy, in the sense that I mean it, that well-functioning democracy would produce lots of protection for gun rights that I think is crazy, right? But it would be a reflection of the strength that these citizens exert because of their power as citizens. And so this is the measure. Like, do we get to a place where we're actually representing something about what the people here are wanting?
So we have another question in the back. Let's see. Yes, sir. You have a microphone there?
My question is primarily for Professor Lessig, but it's about inequality. Can you address the idea of inequality? We've had the riots in Stockholm this last week, which is a big factor in that. You mentioned the financial collapse recently in 2008, which is a factor. Also, you spoke about the Republicans. They are deliberately doing obstructionist policy, and they should be called obstructionists, not Republicans. And every time one of these corporate people get caught, the first thing they say is, well, we didn't break any laws. We didn't do anything wrong. That's because the fix is already in. They already bought the votes in Congress to get the laws to change the way they wanted so they make the profit. If that's the case, how can you actually have any genuine finance, election reform, campaign reform under those conditions when everybody is profiting from the system the way it is, and that's why it was created the way it is?
So let's tag that to the activism, actually making activism change it. Can that at all be done?
Yeah, it's a great point. Hacker and Pearson have a great book called Winner Take All Politics. And they say, look, imagine two societies, one called Broadland, where basically everybody in the society is getting better off, not necessarily at the same rate, but everybody's improving, versus Richistan, which is a society where only the very top, the fraction of a 1% is getting better off, and the rest of society is stagnating or collapsing. And their data support the claim that the United States was Broadland until about 1974, and then the United States became Richistan after 1974. And basically, if you don't count the fact that we tricked women into leaving the home and going out and working all the time, you would take that out, you would say that for the vast majority of Americans, the economic situation has gotten much worse since 1974, and it's only the top group that has gotten better. But the money quote in this book, so to speak, is that the reason for this change is tied directly to changes in government policy. It's government policy that drove this inequality in the way that it did. And why did government policy drive that inequality? I would say tied back to the way in which the campaigns are being funded. Now, this is where, I'm not sure I ultimately agree with the ultimate route that you want to talk about. The reality, I had a former CEO, I gave a speech yesterday at Harvard reunion. A former CEO said to me, you've got to understand, this is a corruption of capitalism as much as it's a corruption of democracy. He said, given the lobbying system, a CEO sits there and a research and development person comes to him and says, we've got a great new idea for a widget. It will give us a 40% return. And then the government relations department person comes and says, we've got a great new idea for a tax break, and if we invest in that lobbying enterprise, it'll give us a 400% return or a 4,000% return. Or there's a paper published in Kansas that found a 22,000% return for lobbying expenditures to get a tiny little bit of the law changed. And his point was, as a CEO, what am I supposed to do? I need to invest my money to maximize the return to my shareholders. And in this system, the way I should invest my money is in lobbying and in corrupting the system, as opposed to spending my money inventing great new widgets. Now, if we changed that, if it didn't there wasn't a return on investment from lobbying in this way, if we changed the way we funded elections so that they had no more power than anybody else would in this system, I'm not yet convinced, this is my Republican roots, but I'm not yet convinced that capitalism couldn't go back to doing the thing that we celebrated in the 18th and 19th century that it did, which was to raise the income of people broadly and not in a way that concentrated in the very, very rich. If it doesn't, I'm happy to entertain the more fundamental challenge, but I think in the immediate term, what we at least have to do is to make it so the richest people in the world don't have as their number one objective finding a way to further corrupt governments to make them even richer. That's the reality we have right now.
Tenny, comment on that.
Yeah, well, I very much agree that the first step is to stop this link between politicians and big money. And I think a very good example from America is the role of Monsanto. I mean, Monsanto is basically owning agriculture policy, agriculture law, and owning every single farmer in the United States. And if there's one they don't know, I'm sure they're going to make them go bankrupt.
Who are they?
Monsanto is the biggest producer of genetically modified seeds and also the biggest producer of pesticides in the world. And funny enough, they're also the only one producing the pesticides needed to kill the weeds for the GMO they're putting in the fields. And they have passed laws making it illegal for farmers to keep their own seeds for the next growing seasons. They have to buy new seeds because they're getting the patent on the seed types. And that's happening because the United States is letting big money define the politics. But I'm not sure if you I know you have different suggestions for how you can change the financing of campaigns, but I'm not sure that if you change the financing so they weren't depending on a company like Monsanto, you would still have a billionaire company who would do whatever it takes to get the right laws passed. And I'm sure it would, we need to make that kind of big money stop. I think we need to make some restructuring so we don't have companies owning patent and owning such a big share of the market. And I'm not sure that would be solved by
Carl first, and then, okay, Jan, you want to go first?
I would actually like to object a bit to this picture of American politics we're getting here as totally dominated by big money. I actually think there's another problem, which is, in a way, activism. I mean, your political system is designed to, protect the status quo. That was the whole idea with the Constitution, to make it hard to make reforms, to make decisions. And as you say, yes, for quite some time in American history, that problem has been overcome. But now, what's stifling the American political system right now is not necessarily money, but the fact that Congress and the system is so radicalized, it's so polarized. And why is it so polarized? Well, it's not because of money necessarily, but because of idealists that are, getting elected by their activists. So the activists actually choose who stands for election for each party, and that makes the Democrats go in one way and the Republicans in the other way, and that's polarizing the system.
But you're saying that an activist here is then corrupt, or an activist
no, I'm
is
not
corrupting
saying,
the system?
I don't want to call this corruption, even to begin with. I'm saying that this is also a way which activism affects the system.
No, but
it polarizes the entire political system.
But I think you've got to see the way in which the polarization is a product of the fundraising, right? So Chris Murphy, who's the youngest member of the United States Senate, describes that in their shop, in their campaigning shop, when they send out an email that radically attacks the Republicans, he's a Democrat, they receive 3 times the amount of money from that email as they do when they send out an email that just talks about the good ideas that the Democratic Party has. The business model of fundraising is polarization. The more you can call the other side crazy and insane, the more you will raise money for your side. So the whole mentality of Washington has become polarized as a product of the business model of fundraising. And if we didn't have that pressure, it would make it easier for them to begin to work together the way historically they have worked together. It was Newt Gingrich who radically changed the Congress. He's the Speaker of the House in 1995, who radically changed Congress to become this permanent war zone of Democrats versus Republicans as a way to facilitate the fundraising. So I agree with you. Of course we are polarized. We're more polarized than at any moment since the Civil War. But I'm suggesting we need to see the link between the polarization and the incentives that the fundraising culture produces.
Works in the other direction too. Polarization is driving fundraising. And what's driving both actually is the primary system. And that's what's fundamentally changed, and that's earlier. That's in the 70s. So these are processes that come from from the parties.
Well, we're thinking about it as well. Carl, you want to finish something?
Two things. Just, you were rather dystopian. You said that they would rather spend on lobbying than widgets. But still, the best widgets still come from the United States. But I would like to see your take on the activist grassroots movement. You have that in America too, and it's so much maligned Tea Party movement. It's a very mixed bag, but doesn't that sort of address some of the problems you're talking about in its own, maybe you would think, perverse way? But still, they seem to see a problem.
Yeah, I think the Tea Party at its birth, which a significant part of the Tea Party was a very authentic grassroots movement, taken over, I think, later by Fox News and Beltway Republicans, but a very authentic grassroots movement. That movement could easily have focused on this core corruption that I think it explains the problems of our government. And if they had framed it like that, could have really built a cross-partisan movement in the United States. But it is spun into Republican crazy land, and it's not going to be that movement right now. But I agree with you, that was a core.
We're going to take a final question from the audience. We had somebody in the back here. Yes, sir.
I'd like to first thank you all for being here. This has been very interesting. So you've spoken about corruption in the legislative branch in the United States and how members of Congress are constantly fundraising and they're basically giving favors to their fundraisers rather than representing the people. And I want to ask, what can the role of the judicial branch be in dispelling corruption in politics in the United States? Because these are members of the government with quite a bit of power who are not directly elected.
Care to start?
Well, of course, the United States Supreme Court has done all that it can to make this problem worse by a series of decisions that make it increasingly difficult for Congress to actually regulate the problem in any sensible way. But I don't focus my energy on trying to reform the United States Supreme Court. It's because, the thing to recognize, in the United States, there's this huge progressive movement focused on the decision Citizens United, which finally clearly stated that corporations have a constitutional right to spend as much money as they want influencing political campaigns as long as it's independent of the candidates. And when that decision came down, it really sparked a movement in the United States. Millions of people have now been involved in protests and reforms and resolutions to try to get Congress to pass an amendment to overturn Citizens United. But the thing to recognize is the day on January 20th, 2010, which is the day before Citizens United was decided, the American democracy was already broken, right? Citizens United shot the body, but the body was already cold, right? So it's not that we can fix this problem just by fixing the Supreme Court. We could have a court that was more encouraging of Congress fixing the problem, but ultimately this problem will only be fixed if citizens in America create the pressure on politicians to reform the system which they've produced. And let's hope the court doesn't muck that up too.
Well, we can't be too sure. We're gonna start closing off the first or the webcast session of this since we're approaching 9 o'clock. But don't go anywhere because we're gonna stay and keep on having more fun once we're done with the webcast. And my final question to you all is a question I asked you to think about a little bit before because it's a hard one. We've talked about how other people are corrupt. We've talked about what mistakes other people make. I'm going to ask you, all of you, to name your price, to name the occasion or the circumstance where you yourself would become corrupt. I'm assuming that most people who are not corrupt out of pure evil in their souls, but because of some sort of circumstance. Carl.
You just want to ask us about our financial situations, that is. Because I remember once hearing Nelson Rockefeller when I was a student in America, and he sort of not praised himself, but he said, I'm so rich that I can't be corrupt. And it's something to it. You can't buy him. You can buy other people, of course. But, of course, I would probably vote for Sverigedemokraterna if they gave me 10 million crowns, and even for Miljöpartiet if they gave me 12.
So there's the money, and then you could use the money to influence policy the other way.
Yeah.
So you can even, and then you would justify it.
I will negotiate when the lights are out.
But this seriously though, this is interesting because what you're saying is, here's my price, but I would use the money to do something good with it. So you're negotiating with your moral standards right away. That's the first thing that happens when you're corrupt.
Of course, your question is a bit unfair because it was so easy to sit up here and say, no, I will never sell myself. Of course I would. Everybody would.
Jan,
Yeah.
at what point will you become corrupt?
Well, it's a really interesting and a tough question. And unlike Carl, I'm a public official. So I can actually be corrupt under the standard definition, which is abuse of public power for private gain. Carl cannot be corrupt, actually, although as a voter, maybe. What would be my price? When would I, take a bribe in order to give a student a higher grade or something like that? Well, I think that price is really, really high because I don't really see sort of what I could. How I could continue doing what I do after having done that. So I would say that I wouldn't go corrupt until my family was in danger or I could really save someone from being corrupt.
Right. So this is then the traditional thing of money in an envelope kind of corruption.
Yes.
So that's the kind of corruption we're talking about there.
That's what I'm talking about. Yeah.
So Tanya, at what point will you sell out your ideals and become corrupt?
I would like to say never, of course. But I've thought a lot about it, and well, it depends on how we define corruptions, really, because I'm not a big spender. I don't have a big consumption. I don't need so much money.
So let's talk about corruption of your values rather than
so
just
let's
cash.
talk about it broader. I guess it wouldn't be a corruption of my values because I guess I would sell out the minute that I calculated that by selling out I could probably gain more in some other end. Like by selling out on my own values, I could maybe meet some of my other political gains.
Okay, so a straight cost-benefit analysis.
Yeah, I guess that would be it.
Yeah, and Lawrence?
Yeah, so when I was your age, I would have said none, ever, couldn't possibly happen. But I think the question is for what, or for whom? So for my kids, sure. Right? If there was a position like I knew the only way to save them or the only way to help them in a fundamental way was to compromise myself in a fundamental way, of course. We do that all the time. People go to war in that, that's the ultimate corruption of your life, like the destruction of your life. So I think it's the question of motive, and that actually points to what is the most dangerous part of this kind of good soul corruption, right? Because you think, I run a center at Harvard, and we study this kind of corruption in a lot of contexts. Doctors taking money from drug companies, or academics taking money to give for public policy. But when you see researchers, for example, running research departments where they realize if they don't bend to the corporate money, their research department gets shut down, and all of their employees are out of work, and the students don't have a place to go next year. It's in those kinds of contexts where they feel justified, they feel empowered to bend the rules, because it's the only way to save other people. So it's not to help themselves necessarily, but it's to help other people. And it's that motive which I think is very hard to speak against. What are you going to say? Trying to help somebody else? You shouldn't be helping somebody else? And if you think about where corruption is at its worst, especially in politics, that's exactly the justification. Why are politicians in America corrupt in this sense? Because they say, this is the only way we're going to be in power to do the good things we're going to do, not recognizing they can't actually do anything anymore anyway. But that's their justification. We have to sell out in order to be in power so that we can protect the republic against those evil Republicans or against those evil Democrats.
That might actually be true now and then.
Yeah, it might be.
So we've concluded that we're all for sale. What a cheerful ending point. But friends, it's time for us to close the webcast. Thank you so much for showing. Thank you for participating the way you did. Thank you, those of you who have been watching on Sydsvenskan.se tonight. You can change your policy. You can get here the next time. You're going to have a lot more fun because we get to after party and you don't. But thanks for watching tonight anyway. Ladies and gentlemen, a warm hand for this fantastic panel.